Hello good people of the world, it's the Big Heavy, and the very first video that I ever posted on YouTube was essentially kind of on a lark. It was mostly to show friends and some other folks my tiling project in my garage, which is actually below where I'm sitting now, and I thought it was the business. I mean, it was a cool time-lapse video. There was some fantastic music that I thought was bringing 88 back. That's 1888. But took a little flack for production quality, took a little flack for music. I mean, apparently there's people out there that don't like the same ragtime piano song on Endless Loop for 20 minutes. I mean, who knew? I also noticed that there were quite a few comments. You know, I never posted this for commentary, I never posted it for anything more than my own edification, but a lot of people had questions on, you know, how do you do a tile installation in your garage? Do I like it? Has it been functional? And it's 5 years later. So I thought I'd revisit some of those questions and go back and talk through some of the things I wish I'd known when I started this tile project. And probably the first question on your mind, and you know, maybe the most important, is would I do it again? Do I like the tile on my garage floor? And you know, this being YouTube, and after some of the complaints about my production values, the only real way to answer this is obviously through a YouTube hype reel. So cue the hype reel. All right, with that bit of absolute, abject, utter nonsense and general creation of additional entropy in the world, in case you didn't get the point through the air horns and other nonsense, yes, I would do it again. I absolutely love the tile in my garage. You know, I think the thing I like most about it, flooring, is something that you see every day. It's got an aesthetic value. It's got a very practical value. You know, it's what your feet and all your stuff is on. You see and feel every time you interact with a space. And for me, whenever I go in there, it doesn't feel like a garage. It kind of feels like, half jokingly call it the laboratory with my family. And to some extent, it does feel like a lab. You know, I go in there to work out. We have a pretty good home gym set up that I will talk about at some future point. I go in there to build stuff. I go in there to experiment with, all manner of things. And it just makes me happy. You know, even just going in there and wheeling out my bicycle to go for a ride. Or when I'm doing a longer term project, I've got everything set up. The floor is a little bright than a typical cinder garage floor. It's not as dusty, clean. You can just go in there and mop things up. And it just makes me feel good. You know, it doesn't feel like a garage in the typical sense that it's this kind of dirty, dingy place that you go to store stuff. It feels like a place where you come to work, where you come to create, where you come to, essentially make yourself a better person and make the world, a tiny little bit better by building something cool. Which maybe that sounds a little self-aggrandizing, but hey, that's the way I feel. And yes, I put in a pretty significant amount of effort to make that so, and that's what we'll talk about a little bit. So I had a few questions about tile versus epoxy. So if you're not aware, epoxy is the other flooring choice that most people pick for their garage. It's the stuff that comes in a variety of colors. There's grays, tans, whites. It's got those little flecks of multicolored paint in it quite a bit, and it's a pretty popular choice for garage flooring. And the reason I didn't go with epoxy was a few things. Number one, I wanted to be different. I wanted to do something that was a little different, a little bit interesting. Number two, to do epoxy flooring yourself requires quite a bit of floor preparation. So to do it right, you need to get a big old floor grinder, kind of one of those polisher things that maybe you remember seeing your high school janitor running over the floors. You need to get various grinding discs for that floor polisher. It's apparently a massively dusty job and just kind of a hot mess. And having done a little bit of grinding where I need to clean up some of the concrete flooring before I put down my tile, I can attest to the fact that just those little tiny jobs with a typical hand grinder were quite messy. So I can't even begin to imagine how messy a full floor grind would be. I've also seen some epoxy projects where things kind of went wrong for whatever reason. Maybe there was still some moisture in the cement floor underneath the epoxy. I've seen cases where water has come off of vehicles or come off of whatever you stored in there, or just through random happenstance, or some challenge with floor preparation, or maybe some oil that was in the floor that was spilled on the concrete floor before you installed the epoxy. It'll bubble up, it'll kind of flake off, it'll get a little bit nasty. And as far as I know, there's not really a good cure other than grinding up all the epoxy, preparing your floor again, and doing the whole process over again. So with tile, there's generally a bit more longevity. At least that was my theory. I haven't tried this, thankfully, and I'll knock on wood, but theoretically, if you break a single tile, so if for some reason I dropped a really heavy tool or something like that and somehow damaged a tile, you can break up that single tile, you can chip it out, you can get the thin set cleaned up to the best of your ability, and put a new tile in. Now, having done that tile installation, having had to clean up a few things where I made mistakes, and having to clean up thin set that had dried, I don't know how feasible that would actually be, but it's nice that theoretically I could replace a single tile if it broke. Now on that note, again, I haven't broken any tiles. I used porcelain tile. Porcelain's generally the strongest tile that you can get. The tiles will have a hardness rating. It's measured in PEI. I forget what that stands for, but that's kind of how strong your tile is. Porcelain is generally more shatter resistant. Generally has more tensile strength. The stuff I got was kind of an industrial flooring tile. And I've dropped tools on it, I've dropped sledgehammers, and no problems so far. I haven't done any really heavy stuff. I haven't been pulling engine blocks or transmissions or moving an anvil or something like that around. So far pretty resistant, but again, I haven't been doing really heavy duty industrial scale shop type stuff in there. The other thing people ask in the comments is, can you park cars on it? Now for this particular garage, I don't park cars in there. I have parked motorcycles that have a side stand, so there's a pretty good deal of pressure on those. I've parked riding lawnmowers, all manner of bicycles and shop tools, rolling tool cabinets, all that stuff. Obviously no problem there. And what's interesting, and this was kind of completely coincidental, is I went to the local Tesla dealership and they just happened to have the exact same tile, as best I could tell. Same size, same appearance, I assume it came out of the same plant. And Teslas are notoriously heavy vehicles. They've got gigantic batteries in them that weigh quite a bit. The Model X, which is their SUV, is significantly heavy, and they obviously had several of those vehicles parked in there. They were rolling them around pretty regularly. I haven't heard anyone have any problems with parking vehicles on a tile floor. If you go into a lot of high-end and even middle-end car dealerships, you'll see that they have a tile floor in the showroom, and they're rolling cars in and out of there all day long. They're moving desks around and whatnot, and doesn't seem to be much of a problem. So I'm not particularly worried if I ever did park vehicles in there of having any problems with the tile. And in fact, what I've heard from people that have tile, and what was one of the benefits for me, is that ease of cleaning. So if thankfully we don't live in a place that gets a lot of snow, but if you did, and you had that slush and all that junk falling off of your car, it's basically a matter of hosing it out, hitting it with a mop, and you're all clean and ready to go. So what are the negatives of tile? I mean, if you watch that first YouTube video I posted, and even if you just watch the first 15 seconds of it and see the speed at which I did the time lapse and the overall duration of the video, it took a long time. I mean, I forget how many calendar days it took. I think it was something like 25 or 28 or something like that. I was doing that in conjunction with my responsibilities at work and having a family and all that stuff. So, occasionally it was a couple or 3 hours here, a couple or 3 hours there. It wasn't necessarily my full-time job, but it's still time consuming. It's a pretty difficult job. There's several aspects that make it a little different than something like doing framing carpentry or painting, in that there's a physical element to it. You're bringing around these 50-pound bags of thin set, you're mixing them with a big old auger drill, you're schlepping around buckets of thin set and water and all these tools, you're on your knees, you're getting up and getting down and kind of using your body in a different way. And there's also this artistic aspect to it. How do you get the look you want? How do you decide what kind of grout lines you want? How do you keep everything measured so it looks nice? And there's kind of a symmetrical aspect. There's probably a dozen different ways you can lay tile. You can have it just stacked row by row. You can have things offset. You can do herringbones, all kinds of cool things. And then there's also this technical aspect. both in terms of how you put the tile down and you're making sure everything's aligned and level and square to the room and your grout lines are consistent, and also what materials you use. You know, there's in a garage, you're subject to freeze and thaw cycles. You're subject potentially to a subfloor that's moving around and expanding and contracting and doing all these different things. So how do you choose the right thin set? You know, do you membrane that disconnects the tile from the floor? What kind of grout to use? There's all manner of colors. There's epoxy grout. There's even stuff that glows in the dark. So it's this interesting combination of the technical, the artistic, and just kind of the physical and craftsmanship aspect of the job. That if those things, you're hearing that and you're like, ooh, this is cool, this is something I'm interested in, I think it's actually a really enjoyable job. I found it almost meditative in a way when you're setting tile and you're moving your body in these different ways, and you're also very focused on tiny movements and making sure things are set just right. I would, you know, at the end of a day of tiling, be tired obviously, because I was squatting and lifting and doing things that you normally wouldn't do like that. But I also found it kind of relaxing and sort of zen. If you hear things like that and you're like, wow, that sounds horrific, you will hate tiling. In that case, you know, no matter how much you love the look or how much you think it sounds interesting or how much you want to save the money by doing it yourself, run away. You know, hire someone to do it, reconsider epoxy, you know, leave a bare cement floor, whatever. But if that description I just gave sounded horrific to you, I think you know, overall a tiling project of that magnitude will not be fun and will end up being something that you suffer through and maybe don't do as well as you could, and then you're stuck with a floor that's maybe a little janky. Maybe there's some what the tile folks call lippage, where one tile's higher than another, and there's, you know, all manner of aesthetic and trip hazard connotations to that. So run if that did not sound fun. So how about some things I wish I had known when I started my tiling project? There's a lot of them. I mean, I frankly probably spent as much time researching and thinking through the project as I did actually on my hands and knees installing the tile. And I'll try and give you the quick summary, and I'll give you some guidance to some places that might be able to help. And hopefully that at least gives you enough directional guidance that you can save a lot of the time that I spent just figuring out the right questions to ask. So the first one, which I mentioned, is do you use a isolation membrane? And that's essentially a piece of, you know, rubber, for lack of a better phrase. It's probably some sort of high-tech polymer or something like that. But it's essentially a mat that you put between your concrete floor and your tile. And as the name implies, that separates the tile floor from the cement subfloor. And the reason you do that in something like a garage is basically this gigantic slab of concrete. A garage that's well installed, you'll notice, has a line or two going down across, which are our expansion lines. And basically the reason they're in there is so that it prevents the floor from cracking. You know, the floor is again this monolithic, stiff thing sitting on top of earth that's potentially moving around. And without those expansion joints, that floor, you know, if one direction moves a little more than the other, it could crack. And if you have tile sitting on top of that, theoretically it could crack as well. So the two routes you can go when you're tiling a garage that's kind of significant size, mine I think is 24 by 24, is you can either use that isolation membrane, or you can do what's called following the expansion joints, which is what I did. So in the case of the isolation membrane, you get this specialized mat, you use a adhesive to affix the mat to the concrete, you put your tile on top of that. There's this whole process. There's a company called Shooter, whose logo and name I'll put in the video. I may or may not be pronouncing it correctly, but those guys are like the wizards of tile. They sell these isolation membranes, they sell shower pans, they sell metal transition strips. This is what I used at the end of my garage. It kind of has a little offset ramp so you can wheel things in and out. They didn't pay to be in this video. I have no connection to them other than having used their products, but their stuff is awesome. There's all kinds of different finishes. There's all sorts of cool tile-related things. And you can special order most of their stuff from Home Depot and get it delivered right to their door. So brief shout out to Shooter, but they are one of the companies that sell these isolation membranes, which is kind of alternative one. It seemed really complex to me. It seemed like there were some risks to that tile floor not being connected to the subfloor and some potential for cracking or other problems if it wasn't installed absolutely perfectly. And there was a pretty significant cost to it. So I went the route of following the expansion joints. So in my floor, and you can see this in the previous video where I did the tile installation, there's essentially a big cross that divides the floor into 4 quadrants. I basically installed 4 separate tile floors over each of those 4 quadrants. You actually see it in the video, but there's a gap between each of those sections, and I cut the tile down the middle, so there was a physical space between the tiles going over that vertical expansion joint. And then I planned the installation and put some smaller tiles at the top of the garage so that the bottom edge lined up with the expansion joint going across the garage. Once all was said and done and I had grouted the floor, it literally looked like 4 separate floors with this 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch gap between the 4 sections. That kind of allowed the floor to move underneath the concrete. If it moves along those expansion lines, which is why they put them in there, as it should, those 4 separate tile floors didn't have any risk of cracking. And the way you make it look like one floor and not like some sort of goofy thing with this giant crack in the middle is you put a little foam rod, which is essentially just a tiny piece of what looks like pool foam, jam it down into that crack. You put some caulk on top of that. They sell color matched expansion caulk that matches the color of your grout. Put a line of that on top. It looks good, matches the rest of the grout, and unless you kind of know what you're looking for, you probably wouldn't notice it. 5 years in, have gone through winter, rain, heat, dry, all that stuff, and haven't had any problems with cracking. Again, we'll do the ceremonial knocking on wood there. But that's what I would recommend unless you had a really compelling reason to go with the isolation membrane. It just, for me, seemed like a lot of trouble and cost and potential for something to go wrong that just wasn't worth it at the end of the day. Other things I'll mention that I wish I had known, and I discovered this relatively early on, but when you buy your tile, really think through not only the look and how it appears physically and how it matches the design of the rest of your garage or whatever you're tiling, but pick something that has the right performance characteristics for what you want. So I talked about PEI and that hardness rating. I talked a little bit about porcelain versus ceramic. In a garage application, I wanted something that was hard and kind of that industrial grade. Porcelain, I think it has a PEI of 5, which is the highest that I was able to find. The other thing that was a consideration was I got tile that's called, it has what's called a rectified edge. So they make sure that the edge is square, it's kind of nicely polished. Everything is perfectly square and flat, which is important if you buy a cheaper tile or one of the long tiles that was popular for a while that kind of had a hardwood look. If it's warped a little bit and you install a bunch of those side by side, you're gonna have that lippage problem. And again, that's where one tile stands a little higher or lower than the one next to it. Not only does it look a little janky, but even if it's just a 1/16 or even a 32nd of an inch above the tile next door to it, when you're walking, you can catch your shoe, you can trip, and it causes problems if you're rolling cabinets around or something like that. So something you want to avoid, and you can avoid that by paying a little bit extra for the rectified tile and making sure you get something that's in good shape and also has the hardness rating you want. The other thing to look at is they'll provide a rating for how slippery a tile gets when it's wet. In a garage application where I potentially have wet feet, I want something that had good traction. Probably the easiest way to test all this stuff and make sure it has the right look is get some samples. Stores will give you a few samples, put them down, make sure they look right, throw some water on there. Even if it's a little tiny tile, take your shoe or your flip-flop or whatever you're gonna be walking around in and rub your foot against it, make sure it's not too slippery, and pick a tile that's good, looks good, has the performance characteristics you want, and then get that sucker ordered and delivered. The other key thing, and there's some hate on the internet for some of these, but I would absolutely go with the leveling system. I used a system called Raimundi. Again, I don't know if I pronounced that properly or not, but I'll put the name down in the video so you can Google that if you're interested. Again, no kind of commercial connection or anything like that. And I think their starter set is something like $60, which in the grand scheme of installing a large tile floor is basically nothing. And what it does is there's these little plastic spacers that you put in between your tiles. And you should be using spacers no matter what, so nothing all that exciting there. Make sure the gaps are consistent in your grout lines. But then for Raimundi, and the others have various other contraptions, there's this wedge that you jam into the spacer and you use this special tool, and it will take the 2 tile surfaces and make sure they're level by kind of jamming that wedge in. And you put 4 to 8 of those around each tile. Adds a little bit of extra time, probably 25 to 30% once you get comfortable using the system, installation time each tile, but my tile was dead level. I've had professional tile installers come in there and they're shocked at at how good my install is. There's very little lippage. Attribute that 99.59% to buying good tile and using that Raimondi leveling system. And the point lot of zeros one was actual skill, since I have never done a tile installation before this, so there literally was no skill to speak of. Highly, highly recommend that system. And Raimondi seemed good. There's 3 or 4 others out there. I think most of them have YouTube videos, so you can watch people use the system, see what you like, see what's available locally. I think you can order most of them on Amazon, and I'll throw a link to Raimondi down in the description, but highly, highly recommend that leveling system. Other thing I wish I had known, don't be afraid of the pro tile store. And by pro, I mean that's where the people that actually install tile for a living go and buy their materials, buy their tile, buy their equipment, all that stuff. And they're fairly easy to find. Most of them will have a showroom attached. So if you have a local Dow tile showroom, half of the building is all this nice, well-lit tile where homeowners go and ooh and ah, and then the other half is kind of this gritty place with a bunch of counters and bags of stuff that the people that actually do the installs use. Similarly, if you go to some of the companies that make tile equipment, Shooter's obviously one. I use Laticrete for my thin set. All these companies will have a list of distributors, and that's a pretty easy way to find your local pro tiles. A few reasons why I mention that. Number one, they're going to have better grade materials than Home Depot or Lowe's is going to have. Big Orange and Big Blue kind of have a couple or 3 generic types of thin set. They won't have that specialized stuff that's designed for something like a garage where you've got heat and cold and expansion and you want a specialized thin set that'll handle all that stuff. They won't have things necessarily like epoxy grout or some of the more interesting materials that are worth using. And the second thing is generally they're pretty willing to help you out and give advice. I wouldn't go at 7 in the morning on a Monday when every tile installer in America is trying to get his or her stuff for the week set up and probably in a hurry. But if you go at 10 or noon or something when it's quiet, you come in with a positive attitude, you're polite, you're kind, you sort of say, hey, here's the project I'm trying to do, here's what I've researched, here's what I'm thinking, is this directionally correct? I've always found those people are more than willing to help you. They'll give you great advice. They spent a lot of time with me identifying the right thin set product to use for my garage floor. Listed in my earlier tile video, I can't remember the exact product number, but it worked really well. It's been great so far. But if you come in, you show an interest, you're polite, you show that you actually did some research before you walked in there, I've universally found that those people are more than willing to help you. They have a better selection. They can special order all manner of crazy stuff, including glow-in-the-dark grout or whatever you want. So go to the pro tile shop, even if it might be a little intimidating when you first walk in there. I know it was for me. It's not set up like a Home Depot. It's a very different experience, but it's one that's hugely beneficial. Kind of a related tip in terms of tools, you're going to need some specialized tools to do a tile installation. There's trowels, get a whole ton of those Big Blue or Big Orange 5-gallon buckets. That's what you're going to mix up your thin set in. There's various theories on whether you clean those or just throw them away afterwards. I could generally clean mine once or twice before it got so much funk in there that I couldn't get off with anything short of a chisel. That I probably went through a dozen or so of those during the course of my install. So buy a whole bunch of those suckers. Specialized tools, kind of the big investment items you'll need are a tile saw. Tile saws put water on the tile, since that keeps the blade cool, since you're generating a lot of heat, essentially cutting a piece of stone or glass. And you'll also need a large auger drill to mix up your thin set. I know people talk a lot of junk about Harbor Freight. A lot of their stuff is of varying quality. If you're not familiar, it's kind of a national chain that sells, for lack of a better word, kind of knockoff grade tools. They are massively cheap. Again, they're variable quality, but for tiling, I had really good luck. I bought their big tile saw. It came with a stand so you could roll it in and out. I bought a more expensive DeWalt diamond tile blade that I threw in there, and it cut tile like butter. If you do buy that same saw, throw that into Google. There's some tricks to it, mainly around the pump. If you put it in a bucket of clean water, it'll do great. If you put it in the water repository, it'll clog up pretty quick. So a few minor nuances, but worked great and was probably half the price of kind of the pro grade or even the prosumer grade saw for cutting those larger tiles. Same thing with the auger drill. Basically, if you try and use even if you have a really good cordless drill to mix up the thin set, you're gonna kill your drill, like on the first bucket. It just doesn't have the torque to turn through this stuff that's basically the consistency of peanut butter, and it's 5 gallons of it. So, I think the Harbor Freight auger drill, which is essentially just a big drill for, drilling through large wood or, boring big old holes with, big 2-inch drill bits. I think it was like 30 bucks. It's not cordless, you got to plug it in, but it went through a good 20, 50 pound bags of thin set, mixed it like a champ, never burned out. Has a little kind of cruise control thing so you can lock down the trigger and just get on there and mix up your thin set and work right through it. So 2 great tools. They also have a great resale market. I sold them on Craigslist, I think for 85% of what I paid for them new, which was way cheaper than renting, way more convenient, and I got something that hadn't had the crap beat out of it by being in a rental tool fleet. Final thing I wish I had known, half the battle of tile setting is cleaning up. You gotta clean all your tools at the end of the day or the thin set gets hard and it's just a bear to clean that stuff off. And similarly, when you finish up at the end of the day, I would basically work a bucket of thin set at a time and then I'd kind of be done for the day. I learned very quickly, clean between the joints after you set a tile. Any thin set that kind of comes up, I think the technical term is literally spooge, which, sorry, it's a bit gross, but you're pushing these tiles down, thin set can come up between the joints between 2 tiles. If you let that stuff harden, you gotta go in there and you gotta grind it out. And as somebody that left a lot of thin set in their joints can attest, it's a friggin' bear. So I learned the lesson really quickly, after you set a tile, clean the thin set out, clean the thin set on the edges, because when you come back tomorrow or the next day or 3 or 4 days later to set your next row of tile, if you let a bunch of thin set kind of spooge out between the row that you just installed, it's going to make it really hard to set the subsequent row. It's going to make it so you potentially have some lippage and you might even have to go in there and grind out some of that dried out crud before you can start to set that next row. So clean, clean, clean. Clean your tools, clean up each row, and just spend the time to be a little bit meticulous. Similarly, if you get thin set on your hands, which you absolutely will, clean it off any tiles while it's still wet. That will make your life 100 times more easy. At the start of your project, I would find your rattiest, least favorite pair of pants, because probably the easiest way to clean thin set off is just wipe it on your pants. After you finish a project like this, those pants are going to be funky, they're going to be covered in thin set, and it ain't coming off. So clean, clean. So those are my pro tips. And if you get stuck anywhere, if you kind of need some resources, number one, I'd use that local pro tile shop, especially if you're buying materials from them. That kind of creates a symbiotic relationship where they're hopefully willing to help you. The other thing I'd recommend, there's a website called the John Bridge Tile Forums. If you put that into the Google machine, I'll also put a link to that in the description. It's an old school forum. The people on there are, a lot of them are old school tile setters with decades of experience. You show up there much like the tile store and you've kind of done some research. You ask a thoughtful question, you kind of say, hey, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's the options as I know them. I'm thinking about this versus that. People are more than willing to help, and I got great advice on them. Post pictures. If you get stuck, you can ask people about different aspects of the installation process and they will almost universally help you. If you roll in and say, tile in my garage, don't know where to start, please walk me through step 1 through 197, you're not going to get as good a response. So again, kind of do your homework and try and use that as a resource where you get stumped. And finally, if this was helpful at all, hopefully it encourages you to launch that tile project that you've been thinking about. If you're someone that's, the description I gave you sounds appealing, and slide on down and hit that subscribe button while you're here. Slap a little thin set on the like, and I promise I will not put any more ragtime in any tile related videos, and good luck to you. Peace.